Hello everyone, Stepan here. I'll continue the series on the King's Gambit with 3 more defenses black has. After the moves e4, e5, f4 the King's Gambit, ef4 the King's Gambit accepted, and knight to f3. We are still on this move, which is by far the main move in the King's Gambit accepted, and with this move white is basically preventing any queen to h4 checks. So this is the main line. Another move that we are going to look at will be bishop to c4 after e takes f4, but for now knight to f3 still. And we've already been over the Fischer defense, which is pawn to d6. We've been over pawn to d5, which is the modern defense. And today we are going to go over 3 more defenses black has on move 3. And all 3, I have to say, are not the main lines for a very good reason. One more move we are going to go over in the next 2 videos will be the move g5, which is the main line. And g5, the main line, and pawn to d6, the Fischer defense, are considered to be the main and the best responses for black. And basically black is able to get a favorable position regardless of how white reacts to those 2 moves. And in theory, those 2 moves have been, were proven to defeat the King's Gambit. Now, in Grandmaster chess and in high-level chess, things don't really work that way, and people are not supercomputers, so there are several other options black could adopt, and especially since alternatives to the main line are often not as well known as the main lines, of course, so you might surprise your opponents with them. Today, we are going to go over the Cunningham Defense, which is bishop to e7. We are going to go over knight to e7, which is the Bonsch-Osmolovsky Variation, and we are going to go over pawn to h6, which is the Becker Defense. So these 3 will be in one video, because the theory in them is not as broad as in, let's say, the Fischer Defense. Let's continue with bishop to e7, the Cunningham Defense first, and this is probably the most popular of the 3 sidelines. In live book there have been over 150 games in Grandmaster games. Garry Kasparov has played this and many other strong grandmasters, so it's definitely a viable defense to the King's Gambit, and there's nothing wrong with that. But as I said, it's not as precise as d6, d5 or g5. To bishop to e7, white has 2 main moves. One of them is bishop to c4, which is the main line, and the other one is knight to c3, which I find very comfortable for white. Now, the point of the move bishop to e7, the Cunningham defense, is that you now have 2 attackers on the h4 square. And now you are basically able to dislodge the white knight from the e1 square and prevent it from castling further on, because the king has to move. So the logical continuation after knight to c3, which does nothing about controlling the h4 square, one way to control it would be queen to e2, and that would mean that after bishop check you could take, and after queen checks you could play queen to f2. But this is not as popular, and it basically gives away any initiative white might have had for the pawn, so this isn't a popular variation. So after bishop to e7, white plays knight to c3, accepting this check. So bishop h4 check, king to e2. And in many King's Gambit accepted positions, white is going to go for a king walk, and his king is going to be unable to castle. But after king to e2, white's position is actually perfectly safe. Not visually, but it's safe, and white isn't in any trouble. The position is almost equal. Here black continues with d5. You have to take that. It is a pawn sacrifice after all. Knight takes d5, knight to f6, now attacking both the pawn and the knight, so black is going to regain the pawn. However, white has the option of taking on f6, basically saving the pawn he just took. So knight f6 is the best move, queen to f6. And now, if you want to play it safe, you can play d3, but your position is still kind of risky. You still have your king on e2, and you want to gain central control immediately. And the point of the King's Gambit, the point of the move f4, is that you want to remove the e5 pawn from black's position to make sure that you can play d4 sort of free of charge. So here, instead of d3, I would recommend the move d4, gaining as much space as possible. And now if you assess this position, White did manage to regain his lost pawn, and in fact white has a favorable pawn structure in my opinion. So position assessment, king safety, black is better. Pawn structure, white is better. Material is equal. Piece activity, well, you could argue that it's equal as well. Black has 2 pieces developed, white has 1, and he has a bad king, so yeah, it's sort of equal. Now the position continues with bishop to g4, pinning this knight to the king, queen to d2, putting pressure on the f4 pawn, knight c6, putting pressure on d4, and now c3, defending the weakness, g5, defending f4, king d1, and you want to get your king to safety, to c2, and you want to be able to defend this way. So now castles for black, king c2, your king is now safe, bishop takes f3, g takes f3. This is the main line that happens after knight to c3 in the Cunningham defense, and I just couldn't find a single problem for white, and I was analyzing this position for a long while. Because I actually want to be prepared for any defense black could play, and I'm trying to find a single variation I'm going to adopt, and I'm planning to start playing the King's Gambit, so bishop to e7 is definitely a possible way for black to play. So my plan is to, after bishop to e7, if black plays the Cunningham defense, my plan is to go into the knight c3 line, which is far less popular than bishop to c4, and as you can see, it leads to quite comfortable positions. Your king is open, okay, your king is going for a walk, but you have a broad center and it's not really sure what black has. Okay, now as for the main line in the Cunningham defense, and of course the main lines are always objectively better, that's why they are the main lines, is bishop to c4. With the move bishop to c4, you have a common King's Gambit attacking plan for white. Put pressure on f7, it's as simple as that, and castle as soon as possible. Just not caring about your lost pawn. Knight f6 for black is the main move, e5, dislodging the knight from the defensive square, knight to g4, and now white castles. In this position, I would rather have white, because I think that I have more attacking prospects than black does, and it's not really sure what the knight is doing on g4 after the move such as h3. So I think the black knight is misplaced, the bishop isn't really active on e7, the queen is blocked, the king can castle, but white has a definite lead in development, f4 is a certain weakness, and if black plays g5, then where's the black king who is now on e8 going to find safety? Black here continues with knight to c6, putting pressure on the e5 pawn. White plays d4, defending the pawn, and d5, which is the main move. Here, you don't really want to allow black to block your center, even though bishop to d3 might seem like a logical continuation, putting pressure on h7. The best move is ed6, taking en passant, and after bishop to d6, playing queen to e2 check. You want to open up this position to make sure you can exchange the queens and have a lead in development with a slightly better pawn structure. Here, if you count the material, white has 6 pawns, black has 7. But the f4 pawn is going to be indefensible because you always have pressure on the f7 square and you have 2 attackers on f4. So this is the reason why after d4, d5 you play ed6 and you provoke a queen exchange. Bishop to e6 isn't possible because bishop takes, f takes, queen takes check, and after queen to e7 the knight is hanging. Bishop to e7 back is a really passive move, and I would bet that white can simply take here and be better, or do something else. So queen to e7 is basically forced. Now queen e7, knight e7, knight to g5. And you are getting your pawn back with a favorable position. So you are attacking the f4 pawn twice, you are attacking the f7 pawn twice, so black has to decide which to protect. Castles is best, and now bishop f4, and you got your pawn back. And if you think about this position, the pawn structure is favorable for white. White has 4 to 3 on the queen side, which means that it's going to be much easier for white to create a passed pawn than it's going to be for black, because 3 to 2 on the king side is really hard to utilize due to the kings being close. So white is going to have an easier time creating a passed pawn, which means that any endgame is slightly favorable for white. A sample continuation, knight f5, bishop to d3, attacking the knight, h6, forcing the knight away, but now you have a tactic, bishop takes f5, bishop takes f4, rook takes f4, hg5, rook g4, bishop f5, rook g5, bishop c2, rook c5, and I would rather have white. It's equal, of course, but white is a smidget better. So This is the main line of the Cunningham defense. After bishop to e7, which is a playable move with a clear idea of bishop h4 check, either play knight to c3 or bishop to c4. I like both, slightly prefer knight to c3, but if I see bishop to e7 on the board in my games, I'm going to be happy because I'm prepared either way, and there aren't really that many attacking possibilities. Black has, if your king goes to e2 and to d2 and to c2, it's not really a big deal. Remember that. Okay. Moving on, the second defense I want to talk about in this video is the Bonsch-Osmolovsky variation, which is knight to e7 instead of bishop to e7. Now, the idea behind this move is that black often wants to reroute his knight to g6, which isn't actually what happens most of the time, but it's a very clear plan of defending the f4 pawn. The second thing is that black is controlling the square d5. And yeah, developing his pieces. In some positions, black might even try g6, bishop g7. But as I said, knight to e7 is a common developing move, and you can either play knight to g6 or knight to d5. So the knight is really useful there. If you manage to get knight to g6 in, then your f4 pawn is defended sufficiently, and you have a fine position. Here, white can't waste any time, and knight to e7 is a slightly inactive move. The Bonsch-Osmolovsky variation actually is sort of comfortable to play for white because black isn't putting any immediate pressure on white's position. Bishop to e7 is much more active, threatening this check. Knight to e7 doesn't really threaten anything. So white here has two options. I would recommend the latter one. So bishop c4 is a sideline, putting pressure on f7, and of course it's going to be hard to defend. You can see that because black can't castle, black doesn't have any knight to a6, of course. So here in this position, black has to continue with d5, e d5, knight d5, castles, bishop to e6. I'm not sure whether white should go for this bishop to c4 line. I'm not sure that it gives as much activity. Here after bishop to e6, you probably have to play bishop to b3 and then d4, putting pressure on the f4 pawn. You are going to get your pawn back, but I think the main line is more active. So after knight to e7, what I would recommend is the move d4 immediately, so that after d5, you can either play e5, which sort of dampens your attacking chances, closing down the center, or the move knight to c3, which I really like. And this is what I plan to play against knight to e7, the Bonsch-Osmolovsky, because after knight c3, black of course has to take, his pawn is attacked, so d4, knight e4, knight d5, defending the f4 pawn. You can now play bishop to d3. And you can see how harmonically white's pieces are developed, and white is controlling almost every key square in the center. I just love this position. The fact that you're a pawn down is completely irrelevant here. Black has 7 pawns, but the f4 extra pawn is meaningless. And I really like white's position here. You're going to castle, either queenside or kingside, and you have a lead in development and attacking chances. The black king is still stuck in the center. Black tries to castle here, so bishop to e7. White can either play c4 or castle short. I would recommend playing c4 because castling short is sort of passive compared to castling long later on, and it will most likely transpose if you want to castle short later in the position. And you have to play c4 anyway, removing this knight. So I would recommend the move c4. Your king isn't under any pressure, so you can just relax. If this check comes now, I think it would be too risky because after bishop check, knight takes, queen check, king to f1, white has too many pieces open up and the knight is hanging anyway. So black will have to move the knight and then probably lose this pawn, or queen to e2 and knight somewhere. So this check isn't really a plan for black now. So after c4, black plays knight to e3. That's the best move. That's actually the safest way to give the pawn back. Black wants to get rid of this bishop, so now queen to e2. You can take immediately as well, it doesn't matter. Castles, bishop e3, f3, queen takes e3, and now bishop to g4. And in this position, I would recommend castling long. And when you compare that to this position in which white castles short, I think that here you have greater attacking chances. Both of your knights are great. If black ever takes, you're going to open up the g-file. You can march your h-pawn up the board. You have a broad center. All you have to do is play king b1 at some point, and have a safe position. Now, the only threat black has, sort of threat, is knight c6, knight b4, trying to take your bishop, but in that case you can play bishop to b1, defending your a2 pawn, and you basically don't want to give up this bishop because it's a great attacking piece on h7, and in conjunction with these knights it could be really dangerous. So castling short is an option, but I would recommend castling long. Let's go over the position once again. So King's Gambit accepted, knight f3, knight to e7, the Bonsch-Osmolovsky variation. I would recommend the move d4, gaining central space immediately, d5, and now e5 sort of dampens your chances, so knight c3, d takes, knight d5, bishop d3, develop all of your pieces harmonically, bishop to e7, and here you can decide to castle short, but as I said, c4 is more active, knight e3. Black can retreat somewhere else, but if black retreats to f6, I think you can just ignore that and play a developing move, or even castle long, because in that case you're going to be a tempo up. So knight e3, queen e2, castles, bishop e3, f e3, queen e3. If black doesn't give back the pawn this way, then he's going to have to give it back anyway. And after bishop g4, castles long, I would always rather have white here. If you turn on the engine thinks white has a slight advantage. It's irrelevant, but from a human perspective, I think that your attack is going to be faster, and ultimately black's king is going to be in much more trouble, because you already have 4 attacking pieces aiming at the black king, and black doesn't really have any attack yet. This is the only attacking piece. This is the second developed piece in the position, so black is far away from creating any chances. Okay, and the third move I wanted to talk about today is the Becker defense, which is the move h6. So not bishop e7, not knight to e7, h6. And h6 has a clear plan, and once we go over the main line, which is in this position, g5, and we are going to go over that in 2 videos, g5 simply defends the f4 pawn, and in some positions black plays h6, bishop to g7, so this is a common plan in the King's Gambit accepted. This is one of the main lines, and the Becker defense simply prepares the move g5 with h6, so it could transpose to some of the lines with g5, and it's a safer way to get the same idea going. So here white aims for the main purpose of the King's Gambit, the move d4, expanding in the center. This is the main line, and I would like to mention one sideline though, which I've been looking at and which I think I'm going to play against the Becker defense over the board. It's a very rarely played move, and it's not as good as the e4, but I think it's hard for black to face that move, and black is going to have to completely change his thinking process if he's been used to playing against the King's Gambit, and this is an idea that not many people play. So the move is b3, and you sort of go for the approach of the b3 Sicilian, trying to get a queenside fianchetto early on and putting a lot of pressure on black's kingside, and black is most often going to castle short, so this is a very useful bishop. You do, however, have to be careful, because black's main move is bishop to e7, and here you actually do go for queen to e2, trying to prevent this. So if bishop h4, knight h4, queen h4 check, queen f2, and your bishop is going to compensate for the lost pawn. So now knight to f6 by black, knight c3, castles, bishop b2, d5, e5, chasing the knight to a, and yeah, I think this is a fine position. And black has a trick here. Black can play rook to e8 because the queen is under pressure, so black doesn't really have to move the knight yet. So if rook to e8, in this position, you can see that white is losing the queen. So after rook to e8, you can just castle. And yeah, I like this position for white. The engines think that black is better because, of course, it's not the main line, and black has an extra pawn, but I think this is quite nice to play, and your king is perfectly safe as opposed to many King's Gambit positions, and you have great attacking chances with this bishop. So b3 is definitely a move to consider against the Becker defense. But let's go over the main line. The main line is d4. And one thing I forgot to mention, the move b3 sort of puts the brakes on black's main idea here, which is g5, which means that h6 was a waste of time. So with the move b3, you've sort of gained the tempo, because after the move b3, black wishes to have his tempo back and play something else, some useful move, such as bishop to e7. So yeah, but d4, the main line, and black now continues with g5. knight to c3, developing bishop to g7. As I said, this is the main setup black is going for with the move h6. Here white should continue with g3, trying to break up this strong pawn structure, fg3, hg3, d6, developing the bishop and preparing to play bishop to g4, pinning the knight, bishop to e3, developing, and yeah, your plan is to castle long in almost every game here, because castling short is far too risky. You can see that these pieces are poised to kill your king. Knight f6, queen to d2, trying to castle long, as I said. And black here can, the best move is knight to c6, but let me just show you how easy it is for black to go wrong here. Let's say black castles, which seems reasonable, and it actually has been played, but it loses by force. If black castles, you immediately have a tactical blow, knight takes g5. After hg5, bishop g5, this position, if you ask the engines, is winning for white, and it's almost impossible for black to defend. Let's say rook e8, castles long, bishop g4, bishop h6. You get to open up the position, sacrifice an exchange or even a piece, but your position will be winning. Here's a sample continuation. This is just too hard to defend, and the king is too naked. So in this position where white goes for queenside castling, black has to be extremely careful with his king. So it's best to keep the king in the center until white has committed and until black has brought some extra forces to the defense. So knight c6, developing another piece. Castles, knight g4, putting pressure on this bishop, and you want to keep this bishop. You don't really want to give it away. It's one of your main attacking pieces and one of your main defenders, because your d4 pawn is hanging as well. So bishop g1, and now castles, because now there's none of that sacrifice stuff on g5. King to b1, getting your king away from the sensitive diagonal. It's always a danger to keep your king there. And now let's say a6. And this is the sort of the start of the middle game in the Becker defense. White has 6 pawns, black still has an extra pawn. I would say that white's king is safer. I would say that the pieces are equally active, but white has a broad center, and sometimes white can hope for sacrifices involving one of these 2 pawns, and I would generally rather have white because I think it's easier to create an attack, and it's not really clear what black does. How does black progress here? Where is the light squared bishop going? I mean, the only sensible square you have is e6, but then here, and okay, you're giving up the e5 square, but I still prefer white. Okay, yeah, sorry if I've moved the board, if you haven't seen the whole board throughout the video, it happens sometimes. So what we've been going over, after knight to f3, the Becker defense, the Bonsch-Osmolovsky variation, and bishop to e7, the Cunningham defense. As I said, sidelines and defenses which aren't as popular as the main lines. G5 is the most popular defense for a reason. D6 is what I would say is the best option for black, and the modern defense we went over already. So quite a lot of options for black in the King's Gambit accepted. One of these 3 could be a dangerous weapon to have in your repertoire, because as I said, most players who play the King's Gambit aren't going to be as well prepared against these, so consider them. Thanks very much for watching. Let me know what you think, and stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye bye.